Hey guys, today I want to talk to you about the basic components of what makes a good photograph. What makes a good photograph, Viola?
Yeah.
We want clarity of light, a good composition, a clear image. So there are tools on our camera to ensure that we can get this, if we can understand manual mode. The three components of manual mode are your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. Aperture is like your eye. Your iris dilates and expands depending on how bright the light is around you. So when you have a lot of light, you can use a tiny, tiny aperture and get lots of detail. When there's less light, you need to use a large aperture to let in more light, but you get less detail. Aperture settings are also called f-stops. Ironically, the opposite size aperture setting corresponds with the opening. So the larger the number for the aperture, the smaller the opening. The smaller the number for the aperture or f-stop, the larger the opening. Yeah. So if you have a shot where you need a lot of detail in the background, kind of like what's going on here, like you can see what's going on in the back of my bedroom, you want a very small aperture, but you need a whole lot of light. If you would like a close-up, like to focus on just one detail and you want that beautiful blurred bokeh in the background, you use a large aperture. That's also called depth of field. So the smaller your aperture, the larger the f-stop number, and the larger your depth of field. The larger your aperture, the smaller the number, and the more narrow the depth of field. So a lot of that has to do with what light is available and what your artistic choice is. You can still use a large aperture when there's a lot of light if you want a blurred background. Sometimes that can be really beautiful and dynamic. Ansel Adams, who, is one of the great fathers of how to develop images, Ansel Adams used very, very small apertures to capture all the details out west for his images. In fact, Ansel Adams and Edward Weston and Imogene Cunningham, who were some of the pioneers in the field of photography, had a club that they called the 69 f-stop club, which is the largest f-stop possible, because they were trying to shoot as many things as they could with that incredibly huge depth of field. Google their names and look at some of their work. Edward Weston, Imogene Cunningham, Ansel Adams. You'll be stunned. Their stuff is glorious. So that is aperture. Shutter speed is kind of like the eyelid of the camera. It's that click that you hear. It's the shutter letting in light. The faster the shutter speed, the clearer the image is going to be. But you can only let in so much light. So the longer the shutter speed, or the longer the shutter is open, the slower the shutter speed, the more still your camera needs to be. Like perhaps use a tripod, or the stiller your subject needs to be. Early photographs had enormous apertures and very slow shutter speeds, which is why they used to hold people's heads in place, and people very rarely smiled because they had to hold still up to 5 minutes at times. Those old tin types before we had 35mm film, when they would do their negatives on glass. Those are called daguerreotypes and tin types. What you see, like from the Civil War era and a little bit before then, and honestly till the turn of the last century, almost all of those images were made with extremely slow shutter speeds and large apertures. So the faster your shutter speed, the more detail you can, the faster your shutter speed, the clearer your image. If you want a lot of detail, though, again, with letting in more light, if you can put it on a tripod and use an extended shutter speed with something that's completely still, you can get a lot more detail. It's all about communicating with the light. Photography, from the Greek, means light writing. So the longer your film, back in the day, or now your pixels, are exposed to the light, the more detail it can read, the deeper that image is. The last component, ISO, which isn't an acronym for anything. ISO doesn't stand for anything. It's derived from a Greek word meaning equal, just so that like all camera manufacturers have like the same standard. ISO basically corresponds to film speed. Back in the day when we still used film primarily, if you remember, if you're old enough, the smaller the number on the film speed, the finer the grain. For instance, for my senior thesis, I used slide film, and I used 64 speed film, or 64 ISO, so that I could blow my pictures up to an enormous size and still have them be extremely clear. I also needed like something like 2,000 watts of light to get these images clear, because the smaller the ISO, the higher the amount of light you need. 800 speed film, if anyone remembers that, was really good for sports because it moved a little faster and it let in a little bit more light, but it begins to get grainy. The higher your ISO number, the grainier the image. So you want to use as small of an ISO as possible, which gets difficult when you're inside, which is where shutter speed and aperture come into play. You know, if you can have a really wide aperture or small f-stop number, wide, small number, and a really fast shutter speed with a flash or something, you're going to get a clearer image and be able to use, you know, a reasonable ISO number, like around 800. 1600 is kind of pushing it as far as clarity, but I do use 1600 occasionally, just so that I don't get fuzzy images. So, ideally, my settings would be 100 on my ISO, like around a 16 to 22 on my aperture for like a really crazy depth of field, if I'm doing nature shots, or even portraits sometimes. And then, you know, a shutter speed that's like, oh my gosh, I can't even remember, but just, you know, hundredths of a second, like just tiny, tiny short. You can barely hear it. But when I'm inside, I have to use, you know, a slightly longer shutter speed. So I ask my subjects to, like, you know, kind of stay still, which is impossible if you have a toddler. So I'll bring out my speed light, my flash. And we're going to talk about flash dynamics at another time. So to get all three of these elements to work together, you need to be able to understand metering, or how metering in your camera works. There are usually several different settings for how you meter. When you look through the lens, you should see a line kind of like a ruler, and in the very middle is the highest point. And when your aperture and shutter speed are set, you want to get as close to that middle by adjusting your shutter speed and aperture as possible, depending on the light. The meter is what reads the light. It's kind of like the radar. It zones in on what you're taking an image of, and it tells you what setting you need for a clear image and a good exposure. So you can get to that middle line by adjusting your aperture, by adjusting your ISO, by adjusting your shutter speed, and then you can also use the different settings on your camera. For instance, aperture priority, which allows you to change the aperture, but it does the shutter speed and ISO automatically, and shutter priority, And I'm not sure what the P does because I shoot all manually, and I should probably find that out. Anyway, you can change those around. But I prefer to shoot completely manually. And when you're shooting completely manually, you're in control. So I usually, the first thing I do when I go to wherever I'm taking my pictures is I set my aperture to a reasonable place, and I set my ISO to a reasonable place, and then I just adjust my shutter. And then I take a picture with it right in the middle, and then this is called bracketing. I look at that, and if it looks a little overexposed, I'll bracket under a little bit. If it looks like too dark, I'll bracket over a little bit. This is the advantage of shooting manually, because I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of times when you shoot automatically, you don't always have a clear exposure, because the camera is just using, you know, it's a machine. It's just trying to take the data and make an automatic assessment. But using your own eye, you can see more detail. I tend to underexpose a little bit when I'm outside because I can bring in detail and more detail that way, and do very slight edits in post-production to bring up the highlights or to bring up the light just a little. I don't like to do much in my editing. I like to do as little as possible. Try to get it right on the camera. So generally what I do is take several shots, some underexposing and some overexposing, until I can get, you know, a really good clear image of whatever I'm photographing. There's different kinds of metering. I prefer spot metering, which allows me to see what the light is doing on someone's face, or like very close to the subject. But you can also do zone metering, which allows you to evaluate the overall value of the picture. A meter looks for a medium picture, which is kind of like a medium gray. This is, again, goes back to Ansel Adams, because Ansel Adams had a zone where you had like a black black and a white white, and then 8 gradations of gray in between. So you meter for the medium, and then you can take your picture